wagon wheels had barely stopped turning when Caleb Whitfield realized the woman stepping down from it would either save his ranch or break his heart. And looking into her eyes, he understood it might be both. The dust from the stagecoach still hung in the air over Coldwater Ridge, Arizona territory, that late summer afternoon in 1878, when Caleb stood at the edge of his porch with his hat in his hands, waiting for the bride he'd sent for. Through a letter and a photograph and a prayer. He was 31 years old, widowed 3 winters past, and the ranch he'd built with his own hands was drowning in debt and silence. He needed a wife. He needed help. What he got, stepping down from that coach in a traveling dress too fine for the desert, was a woman named Sora Nakai, daughter of an Apache mother and a Mexican trader father, raised between 2 worlds and welcomed fully by neither. If you believe in second chances found in the most unlikely places, in love that grows slow and true instead of fast and easy, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this story with someone who still believes in Wild West romance, and subscribe to Wild West love stories so you never miss another tale like this one. Sora did not smile when she saw him. She studied him the way a woman studies a stranger she has been sold to, which was not far from the truth, though Caleb had never thought of it in such ugly terms until he saw the wariness carved into her face. She was beautiful in a way that startled him. Dark eyes that missed nothing, a jaw set with quiet defiance, hands that looked capable of gentleness and violence both. She carried one bag. She had crossed half the territory to marry a man she had never met, and Caleb understood, watching her, that she had made peace with very little of it. That first night, after a supper eaten mostly in silence, Caleb showed her to the bedroom he had cleaned and prepared, fresh linens on the bed, wildflowers he'd picked that morning sitting in a chipped jar on the windowsill. Sora looked at the bed for a long moment, then looked at him and said the words plainly, without cruelty but without room for argument. "I cannot share your bed. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. I came here because my family needed the money your agency paid, and because a woman alone in this territory has few choices left to her. I will cook. I will work your land. I will be your wife in the eyes of the law and the church. But my heart and my body belong to me until I decide otherwise. If I decide otherwise at all." Caleb had heard stories of men in his position storming off, demanding what they believed. Marriage entitled them to, or worse, sending the woman back on the next coach out of wounded pride. He felt the sting of it, no denying that. He was a man same as any other, lonely in ways he hadn't let himself examine too closely since burying his first wife, Margaret, beneath the cottonwood tree out past the north fence. But something in Sora's voice, some old ache beneath the steel of it, stopped him from anger. He simply nodded, told her the small room off the kitchen would suit him fine, and said goodnight. The weeks that followed tested him in ways the ranch itself never had. He watched Sora move through his house like a woman waiting for the ground to shift beneath her, sleeping light, flinching at sudden sounds, keeping a knife within reach even while she kneaded bread dough. He learned in fragments she let slip during long days of shared labor that her mother's people had been driven from land they'd held for generations, that she had watched relatives die of hunger and disease and grief in ways the government called relocation, and she called something crueler. He learned that a man in her past, a soldier stationed near the reservation where she'd lived as a girl, had taught her that trust given to a man in power over her life was trust that got you hurt. She did not tell him this plainly. She told him in the careful distance she kept, in the way she thanked him for small kindnesses like she was still waiting for the debt to come due. Caleb did not push. He fixed the fence line and mended the barn roof and taught himself slowly to let a woman's silence be its own kind of language. He noticed she woke before dawn to watch the sun rise over the ridge, and so he began waking early too, not to intrude but simply to sit a respectful distance away on the porch steps, saying nothing, letting the quiet be shared instead of solitary. He noticed she missed the taste of foods from her mother's table, and he rode 2 days to the nearest trading post to find the dried chilies and blue corn she'd mentioned once, only once, in passing. He noticed that thunderstorms unsettled her in a way that had nothing to do with weather, and the first night lightning cracked over Coldwater Ridge, He did not go to her, only left his door open and told her through the dark that she was welcome to sit by the kitchen fire if the storm troubled her sleep. She did not come that night, but she came the next storm, wrapped in a blanket, and sat across the room from him in silence, until the thunder passed, and something in the space between them had shifted by the time the sun rose. Autumn came hard and dry that year, and with it came trouble neither of them had asked for. A rancher 3 miles east, a bitter man named Garrett Voss, who had wanted the Whitfield land for himself long before Sora ever arrived, began spreading word through town that Caleb had married himself a savage, using words far uglier than that, stirring up the kind of ignorant fear that turns neighbors into mobs. Caleb rode into town after hearing what was being said at the mercantile and did something he had never done in his life. He stood in the middle of the street and told any man willing to listen that his wife had more courage and more grace than the whole lot of them combined, and that the next man who spoke ill of her would answer to him directly. It cost him 2 friendships and nearly cost him a beating from Voss's hired hands, but word got back to Sora before he did, carried by the storekeeper's wife. And when Caleb rode home that evening, bruised knuckles and torn shirt, Sora was waiting on the porch, and for the first time since the day she'd arrived, she reached out and touched his face gently, checking the cut above his eye, and did not pull her hand away when he leaned, just slightly, into the touch. Winter settled over the ranch slow and silver, and something between them had changed without either speaking it aloud. Sora began, humming old songs while she worked. Songs in a language Caleb didn't understand but found himself listening for anyway. She began sitting beside him on the porch instead of a careful distance away. She told him one evening by the fire about her mother, about a childhood spent between 2 worlds that never fully claimed her, about the fear that had followed her every step onto that stagecoach and every day since. And Caleb told her about Margaret, about the grief that had hollowed him out until he'd stopped believing he had anything left worth offering a wife. They were, both of them, 2 people who had learned that trust was a debt too easily called in and left unpaid. But something in the months of patience, of unclaimed space, of small unasked-for kindnesses, had begun rebuilding what fear had broken in each of them. It was deep winter, snow dusting the mesas gold and white under a low morning sun, when Sora came to him without being asked. She stood in the doorway of his small room off the kitchen, wrapped in the quilt her own hands had stitched over the autumn months, and told him that she was no longer afraid, that she had watched him choose gentleness in 100 small moments when cruelty would have been easier, that she had chosen, finally and fully, to give him what she had once sworn she never would. Caleb did not reach for her right away. He asked quietly if she was certain, and only when she nodded, her eyes steady and unafraid for the first time since she'd stepped off that coach, did he rise and cross the room to meet her. If this story touched something in you, if you believe love built on patience is stronger than love built on demand, if Sora and Caleb's slow, hard-won trust moved your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below telling us what part stayed with you most. It means more than you know. And before we close this chapter, if you're watching from Coldwater Ridge in spirit tonight, if you've ever waited for someone to earn your trust instead of taking it, drop the word second chance in the comments so we know you're out there with us. By spring, the ranch that had once drowned in debt and silence had become something else entirely. A home, built not on the desperation of 2 strangers thrown together by necessity, but on the quiet, deliberate work of 2 people who chose each other again and again in 100 small moments no one else would ever witness. Sora Whitfield stood at the fence line that April morning, sun rising gold over land that had become hers too. And when Caleb came up beside her and took her hand, she did not flinch, did not pull away, only laced her fingers through his and watched the light spread slow and warm across the ridge they now called, together, home. The morning where part 1 left off was in truth only the beginning of a new chapter, and Caleb Whitfield soon learned that tending to land and tending to a heart healed at very different speeds. Spring dressed Coldwater Ridge in green, and with that green came news that knocked on the door of Sora's past once more. One morning, while Caleb and Sora were sowing seed together in the field, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, calling Sora's name in the Apache tongue, and the seed bag slipped from her hands. The rider was her cousin, a man she had long believed dead since the night her people were driven onto the reservation and her family scattered to the winds. His name was Tsoan, and his eyes carried the same old sorrow that had once lived behind Sora's own. Tsoan brought word that what remained of the family was surviving hard days on the San Carlos reservation. Hunger, sickness, and little hope left to hold on to. He had come to say that Sora's aunt, her mother's sister, was gravely ill and might not see the season through, and that her last wish was to look upon Sora's face one more time. The news struck Sora like ground giving way beneath her feet. On one side stood the home she had built with Caleb, the trust earned through months of patience and quiet. On the other stood blood she had never truly said goodbye to, only lost. Caleb looked at her and understood at once that this was a choice only she could make, but he understood too that he would not let her make the journey alone. The next day, Caleb left the ranch in the capable hands of Jacob, his trusted hired man, and set out with Sora toward San Carlos. Despite the danger of the road and the difficulty many white travelers faced crossing reservation lines. Over 3 hard days of broken trails and dry canyons, Sora told Caleb stories from her childhood she had never told. Another soul. Nights when soldiers set fire to her village. Mornings her mother hid her so she would not be taken. The last time she had held her aunt's hand before the family was driven down separate roads. When they arrived, the sight waiting for them was heartbreaking. Rows of tents bore the marks of poverty and sickness, and among them were faces that had once known freedom in the mountains, now worn thin with exhaustion. Sora's aunt, a woman named Chiho, lay wrapped in blankets inside a small tent, her body weakened by illness, but her eyes still very much alive. When Sora entered, tears filled Chiho's eyes, and with trembling hands she touched her niece's face as though she could not believe it was real. For the next 2 weeks, Caleb and Sora stayed near that tent. Without complaint, Caleb did work no one would expect of a white rancher, hauling water, cutting firewood, riding to the nearest town for medicine for the sick elders. Some on the reservation eyed him with suspicion, and rightly so, for their experience with white men had too often brought ruin. But Caleb never answered with anger, only quiet, steady work, and slowly some hearts began to soften, none more than Tsoan's, who came to regard Caleb almost as kin. Chiho's condition worsened by the day, and one evening, as the desert sky burned orange and violet, she took Sora's hand and spoke her last words, that her mother's spirit would rejoice to know Sora had found what had been stolen from their people. A home where someone looked at her not with fear but with love. That night Chihu passed quietly, surrounded by family, free. Sora's grief ran deep, yet within it lived a strange peace. She said farewell to her aunt through the old rites, and Caleb stood beside her, honoring every custom, never intruding, only serving as her strength. The moment moved something in Tsoan as well. He told Caleb that he and his small son, whose mother had died of illness, were searching for any way out of the reservation's hardships. Without needing to look at Sora to know it was right, Caleb offered at once that the two of them come live at Coldwater Ridge, work the land, and build a new life. The journey home was different from the one before. Now they were not 2 but 4, Caleb, Sora, Tsoan, and his young son Nantan, whose eyes still held new hope despite the weariness of travel. When they reached Coldwater Ridge, the fields stood green. Jacob had kept everything running, and some in town, having heard of Caleb's courage, now looked upon Sora's family with cautious but growing kindness. That summer, life filled the ranch anew. Tsoan lent his hands to the field work beside Caleb. Nantan's laughter brought the quiet house to life, and Sora felt, for the first time in years, not merely alive but whole, a bridge built between her past and her present. One evening on the porch, watching the sun sink low, Sora told Caleb that the day she stepped off that coach, she believed she was fighting only to survive. But now she knew she had been searching for family all along, and here, with a man who had never asked anything of her but time, she had finally found it. Caleb said nothing. He simply took her hand, and together they watched the land that was no longer just a ranch, but a home, where 2 broken hearts had learned, through patience and love, how to become whole.